Hey guys, in this tutorial I'm gonna show you step by step how to sew a jacket Jens. The jacket has flap pockets, dividing seams at the front, a zipper, a collar with a collar stand, and also a dividing seam at the sleeves with a slit, cuffs, a button and buttonholes. I would describe the fit as loose oversized but not extremely oversized. To sew this jacket you will mainly need a regular sewing machine and a straight stitch. I am going to only use my overlocker to finish raw edges, and you can do that alternatively with your regular sewing machine and a big zigzag stitch. I would say that this is probably not the easiest project for beginners, but as this tutorial is really detailed and shows every step of the process, I would say even as a beginner you can totally do it. To make this jacket you will of course need fabric, and you can use any kind of woven fabric like linen, double gauze, satin, flannel or similar. I have seen many different Jens jackets from different fabrics such as jeans, cord or even coat fabrics. So basically you can use whatever you want, but you need to consider that this jacket was drafted for rather like lightweight woven fabrics and that it can become a bit bulky at the neck area if you're using a too heavyweight fabric. My samples are made of 100% linen woven fabric, and linen is my absolute favorite kind of fabric to use for this jacket as it has a beautiful drape and I just love how it looks. Apart from the fabric, you will need some lightweight interfacing like H180, a divisible zipper and also two buttons with a diameter of 1.2 to 1.5 centimeters. You can find the exact measurements in the written instructions on the materials. Let's start with the cutting, and as always here is an overview of all the pattern pieces that you will need. First I'm going to transfer all the markings to the fabric with a little notch, but you can also use tailor's chalk. I also mark the center of all pattern pieces that have been cut on the fold, which are the back piece and also the back facing. Next I'm going to transfer the position of the pocket to the lower front piece to the right sides of the fabric. As you can see, I've cut out the pocket so I can mark the pocket position right at the corners, and I'm going to repeat these steps at the other lower front piece too. Make sure to use a water soluble pen here, and if you don't want to cut out the whole pocket you can just cut along the corners and fold them away to mark the position of the corners. Next, transfer the position of the button and buttonholes at the cuff. The line is basically the buttonhole, and I will push two needles through the ends and connect them to mark the buttonhole position at both cuff pieces to the right sides of the fabric, and the dot is basically the button position. Here's a little tip for you in case your fabric sides both look the same, like the right and wrong side looks the same. Just place a pin to the right side of your fabric so you can always see which is the right and which is the wrong side. Next I'm going to fuse interfacing to some pattern pieces. Here's an overview with all the pieces that will be reinforced with interfacing, and I like to put parchment paper on my ironing board, and then I will place the pattern pieces and interfacing on top of each other so that the wrong side of the fabric and the sticky side of the interfacing are together. And now I'm placing another layer of parchment paper on top so you can fuse the interfacing to the pieces. And once this is done, you can just cut the pieces out neatly. Now we're going to start sewing the flap pockets, and the first step is to finish the raw edges of the square shaped pocket all the way around. I'm using my serger, but you can also use a big zigzag stitch, and then fold the upper edge 2 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and pin it in place. The upper edge is basically one of the shorter edges. And once this is done, I'm gonna stitch with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Now the remaining edges will be folded 1.5 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and will be pinned in place, or you can just use an ironing template made of cardboard. The dimensions are 13.5 centimeters wide and 14 centimeters high, and with the use of the template you can easily just press the edges to the wrong side and it will get a really nice and neat finish. Now we're going to pin the pockets to the lower front pieces to the right fabric sides, and you will find that they will fit right into the markings. And we are going to pin all the way around, leaving the upper edge open, and the upper edge is the one that we just hemmed. Next, we're going to sew the pockets to the lower front pieces with a regular straight stitch. I'm using a small seam allowance of 2 millimeters, but you can do that as per your preference. And here are corners, so leave the needle in the fabric, lift the presser foot, rotate your fabric and continue sewing. This is the easiest way to get sharp and nice corners. This is what it will look like now, and now we're going to sew the flaps. You are having 4 pieces in total and 2 have interfacing. Now place one with interfacing to one without interfacing, right sides together, and pin them together all the way around, leaving the long straight upper edge open. Next, we're going to sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and here again are corners, so leave the needle in the fabric, lift the presser foot, rotate your fabric and continue sewing. Next, I'm going to trim off the seam allowance right at the corners, and I'm cutting with a distance of 2 millimeters from the seam to make sure I'm not catching it, and then you can turn the flaps right side out and form the corners nicely. You can use a little chopstick. And then I'm going to pin along the edge all the way around, leaving the long straight edge open here again. Now top stitch with a regular straight stitch and a seam allowance of 2 to 5 millimeters. I prefer to use 4 millimeters, but you can choose whatever you like. And last step is to give them a good press. You will find 2 markings at the lower front piece, and now match up the flap with those and pin them right in between. It doesn't really matter which side of the flap is on top, so basically you can choose whether you like the side with interfacing or the side without interfacing being visible, and then take the upper front piece and place it right sides together to the lower front piece so that the flap is basically sandwiched right in between. And next we're going to sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch, and after that we're going to finish the seam. I'm using my serger, but you can also use a big zigzag stitch. Next I'm going to press everything nice and flat, and I'm pressing the seam allowance upwards into the upper front piece that I will now top stitch with a little distance of 4 millimeters from the seam using a regular straight stitch. Now grab your back piece and place both front pieces right sides together on top of it and pin along the shoulders and the side seams. At the neck front, the front piece will protrude a little bit, as you can see here, and this is to make sure that the edges meet at the stitch line and not at the cutting line. Now stitch across the shoulders and the side seams with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Here is a little piece that protrudes at the neck, and after that we're going to finish all the seams. I'm using my overlocker, but as always you can just use a big zigzag stitch instead. Next, I'm going to press all the seam allowances towards the back piece. For the sleeves, I'm going to finish all the inner raw edges using my overlocker, or you can just use a big zigzag stitch. And here is a corner, and this is the part where I just pull my fabric straight. Next, place front and back sleeve right sides together and pin them together along the straight edge. Make sure that you are producing a mirrored sleeve pair. We are gonna start pinning and also sewing at the sleeve cap, and we are going 1 centimeter into the sleeve placket and with a distance of 1 centimeter to the straight edge. Now I'm gonna stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch, stopping within 1 centimeter of the sleeve placket. This is what it will look like now. Next, fold both short edges of the placket 2 times 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side and pin in place. It will look now something like this, and I'm going to stitch with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. And at a smaller sleeve piece, the back sleeve, I will stitch right until the sleeve dividing seam. Next, I'm going to press the seam flat and the seam allowance towards the back sleeve piece, which is the smaller one, and I will also press the placket nice and flat. Next, I'm going to top stitch the seam allowance to the back piece, and I will stitch 1 centimeter into the placket as well to secure both placket pieces right where I'm putting my pin. And I'm going to stitch with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, going 1 centimeter further than the placket start to secure it. And this is what it should look like now. At the sleeve hem you will find 2 markings. These are the pleat, and now place them right sides together right on top of each other and put a pin right into the marking, and then you can fold the pleat towards the placket and pin it in place. And now I'm gonna secure it within the seam allowance with a straight stitch. Now we're going to sew the sleeve seam, therefore fold the sleeves right sides together lengthwise and pin along the sleeve seam. Next, stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch, and then finish the seam. Now turn the sleeves right side out where the jacket remains, wrong side out. At the sleeve you will find a marking which will match up with the front dividing seam, and the dividing seam of the sleeve will match up with a marking at the back armhole. Now put the sleeve into the jacket and pin it into the armhole all the way around so that right fabric sides are now facing. Start aligning the side and sleeve seam, and then you can just match up all the markings. There is another marking at the sleeve which will match up with the shoulder seam. Now stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and then finish the seam. It will look now something like this, and the last step is to pin the seam allowance to the jacket and top stitch it. So I'm basically pinning the seam allowances all the way around to the jacket. It will give a really nice and neat finish. Now top stitch all the way around using a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance to the seam. And now give the seam a good press. For the cuffs, figure out the side without any markings, and this side will be folded 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side, and I will draw an auxiliary line with a distance of 2 centimeters from the edge, so you can fold and press it to the wrong fabric side so that the edge touches the auxiliary line. Next, fold your cuff lengthwise so that the right fabric sides are together and pin them together along the short edges. To do so, I will unfold the 1 centimeter that we just pressed to the wrong fabric side, and next we're going to stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Next, trim off the corners at the side, which is basically closed, and then turn the cuffs right side out and form the corners nicely. If you want, you can take some chopsticks for help. Now pin the non-pressed side of the cuff to the sleeve cuff, right side facing, and you will find a marking at the cuff which will match up with your pleat, and at the front just fold the seam allowance of the cuff away and pin it to the slit so that the cuff seam protrudes by approximately 1 millimeter, and as I mentioned before, the marking will match up with your pleat. And then just pin it right side facing to your sleeve hem, and at the other side of the slit is the same technique. Basically fold the seam allowance of the cuff away and then pin it to the slit edge with a 1 millimeter protruding, and then pin the rest of the cuff to your sleeve hem. This is what it will look like now, and here again are the slit parts where the cuff seam protrudes by approximately 1 millimeter. Now sew with 1 centimeter seam allowance, and at the start and the beginning fold the cuff seam allowance aside so that you don't catch it by accident. And now fold and press the seam allowance right into the cuff. Now we can fold the other side of the cuff and pin it to the sleeve hem as well, so that it basically just covers the seam. And now you can see why we pressed the 1 centimeter seam allowance to the wrong fabric side. It makes it way easier now, and at the slit it will basically be wrapped around the slit and will be pinned in place here as well. And I am pinning my pins crosswise because we're going to stitch from the outside, and this way you can just sew over your pins. And now I'm going to stitch from the outside using a distance of 4 millimeters from the seam, but you can also use a smaller distance, whatever you like, and I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch. This is the final cuff, and now if you align it, you will see that it will automatically overlap. And the top layer of your cuff is the one, or should be the one, with the marking for your buttonhole. Here you can see it. And now I'm gonna stitch the buttonhole. I'm using my buttonhole presser foot, and the length of your buttonhole is always the diameter of your button plus twice its height. Now we only need to sew on the button, and therefore I'm leaving a little thread end at the outside of my cuff, and then I will just sew on the button. And once it's secure, I will bring the thread right between my button and the cuff, and I will wrap it around the button a few times, and then you can just knot the ends. And then you can just cut off the ends close to your button. Next we're gonna sew the collar, and therefore take the upper and lower collar and place them right sides facing and pin them together along the outer edge. Make sure that the edges lay flush, as the lower collar is a tad smaller than the upper one for a better fit. So you might have to pull a little bit to make sure that edges are laying flush. Next, stitch with the 1 cm seam allowance and our regular straight stitch. Next, I'm going to trim back the seam allowance in some areas, and also I will clip into the seam allowance right until the seam. Respectively, I'm going to stop approximately 2 millimeters before the seam to make sure I'm not catching it, and I will just clip into the seam allowance all the way around at every curved part. Next, turn the collar right side out and form the edges out nicely. And then align the inner circle so that the edges are laying flush here, and secure it with a few pins. Now take your collar stand, the one which is reinforced with interfacing, and pin it right sides facing to your collar. Pin along the curved part, and I'm pinning it to my lower collar, the one which is also reinforced with interfacing, and I'd recommend to do it very slowly and to pin at the center first and then at the sides, and then distribute the fabric in between. Also put your pins crosswise into the fabric, as we're gonna pin the other collar stand right at the other side in a bit. This is what it will look like now, and I'm gonna take the other collar stand and pin it right to the other side of my collar, right sides facing, so that the collar is basically sandwiched between both collar stands. Now stitch with a 1 cm seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Go really slowly here in order not to produce any folds, and I would recommend to stitch with the collar stand with the interfacing laying on top, as the fabric transportation is always a bit better at the bottom, and the collar stand without interfacing will probably be a bit more loose. Next, clip into the seam allowance as this is a curved part and stop approximately 1 to 2 millimeters before the seam. And then give your color a good press. Next, pin all the way around the collar and top stitch it. I'm using a seam allowance of approximately 4 millimeters, but you can use whatever seam allowance you like. This is the final color, and now we're going to proceed with the zipper, and therefore just pin the zipper to the front edge of your jacket with the nice side of the zipper facing the jacket. The good side is basically the one that will be on the outside later, and at the bottom of the jacket you will find a marking, and the zipper should end approximately 1 centimeter above the marking. And at the neckline there is also a marking, and this is where the zipper ends. It's also approximately 1 centimeter below the neckline. Now sew with a regular straight stitch as close to the zipper teeth as possible, and here I'm using my zipper presser foot. And now mark the position of the dividing front seam at the other side of the zipper with a pin, and remove it, and then pin the other side of the zipper to the other front edge the same way you did with the other side. Match up the pin with the front dividing seam, and here the zipper should end at least 1 centimeter above your lower marking, and at the neck is also a marking which ends approximately 1 centimeter below your neck. And then stitch the zipper to the jacket with a regular straight stitch and stitch as close to the zipper teeth as possible. Now take your front and back facing pieces and finish the raw edges along the shoulders, and then place front facing pieces right sides facing to the back facing piece and pin them together along the shoulders. Now stitch with a straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and after that press the seam allowances open to make sure that the seam is nice and flat. Now I'm going to finish the raw edge, the outer raw edge of the facing all the way around using my serger. If you want, you can attach binding at this edge, and this is what it will look like now. Next we're going to attach the facing, and the first step is to sew on the collar. It will make it way easier. Start at the center back and pin the collar right sides facing to the neckline. The collar will end 1 centimeter before the front edge, and the side of the collar, which is reinforced with interfacing, is now facing the jacket. Now stitch the collar to the jacket within the seam allowance. That means with a distance of approximately half a centimeter and a long straight stitch. You could ditch this step and just pin the collar, but it's making it way easier. Now take your facing piece and pin it to the jacket so that the right fabric sides are together. Pin all the way around at the front edge, but also at the neckline, and at the front bottom edge of the jacket there is a marking, and this is where the facing piece will end, and the color is now basically sandwiched right between the jacket and the facing. This is what it will look like now, and now we're going to start sewing at the bottom edge of the facing, and here also stitch with the 1 centimeter seam allowance or distance to the bottom edge of the facing, and here are corners, so leave the needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, rotate your fabric and continue sewing. If you, like me, have problems that your fabric is shifting on top and is not being transported very well, you can simply flip it upside down and stitch from the other side, because the bottom layer will always be transported better than the top layer. And then just stitch the facing to the jacket all the way around. Next, trim off the corners at the bottom edge and also at the neckline. Only cut with a distance of approximately 2 millimeters from your seam to make sure that you don't catch it. Then turn the facing to the inside and form the corners nicely. Check if you've caught all the layers correctly. And now we're going to pin all the way around at the front edge, but also at the neckline. Pin everything in place neatly. Next, we're going to top stitch the front edge and also the neckline with a distance of 3 to 5 millimeters and a regular straight stitch. This will give the jacket a nice and neat finish. Now all we need to do is hemming, and basically the hem will be folded 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side and then another 2.5 centimeters. And here I'm drawing an auxiliary line with a distance of 2 centimeters from the bottom edge. And now I'm gonna fold the hem 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side so that it meets my auxiliary line and press it in place. And as the hem is a bit curved, I'd recommend to press with steam. And now fold the hem another 2.5 centimeters to the wrong fabric side and pin it in place. Now sew with a seam allowance of 2 centimeters and a regular straight stitch. And last but not least, give the hem and also the rest of your jacket a good press.